My friends, Cuba is about to fall. Yes, my brothers, because we were expecting something historic, and that's happening right now. Mauricio Galante, the director of the CIA, was in Cuba, and we would obviously like to know what's happening behind the scenes and what will happen after these actions. It seems like it's a chain reaction, right? It's literally like a board game or a puzzle where you put the pieces together and understand. Mauricio, what did the director of the CIA go to Cuba to do? I heard they're about to indict Raul Castro, the dictator.
That's right. Certainly, the director of the CIA didn't go to Cuba for a vacation. He went there to deliver a direct message to the Cuban government about intelligence activities, intelligence cooperation with China, with Russia, and even with Iran itself. And the interception of communications from the Cuban army in which they would be ready to launch drones. Drone attacks against American ships in the Caribbean and even on American territory, right there in the Florida Keys or even in Miami, which are within the range of the drones that were delivered by China, Russia, and Iran. They claim that they would use the drones to defend themselves, but at the time when President Lula met with President Trump, no one knows what was said behind closed doors. But a revealing fact was Lula's interview saying that they had 1 week to launch a plan to fight drug trafficking. It's not me saying this, it was Lula who said it in his own words. Yeah. So the conclusion is that the meeting regarding hemispheric security between Lula and Trump was very tough, and President Trump's message was very clear. Either you do something or the United States will do it. Right after that, Cuba announced that they ran out of fuel. There's no gasoline, no diesel on the island, and a few days later, internal unrest began. People are protesting, asking for electricity because now the country is without power. And a day after the protests started, we have the second visit by a CIA director to Cuba in 65 years, man. So none other than the head of American intelligence. He dealt directly with Raul Castro's son, who's negotiating this honorable exit and this honorable end, if there's any honorable end in any socialist regime. And that's also what you just said. The indictment of his 94-year-old father for the shooting down and killing of 4 American citizens in 1996 who were flying to Cuba on a humanitarian mission. It's the pretext they needed to bring the indictment, just like they did with Maduro, to indict him for some crime committed so that the American court issues a warrant and proceeds with the warrant for his arrest. And then there won't be an invasion of Cuba, there will be the execution of a court order. Then arrest the dictator.
Look at that move, guys. Pay attention, right? We can see between the lines how the system works. How does Trump get authorization to arrest a leader in another country that would theoretically be sovereign? It's all being done under American law, right? Trump doesn't just sign something and go get him. So this excuse, right, of indicting for something that happened back in 1996, and that was an atrocity, right? Because the Cuban regime was a bloodthirsty regime. They did the worst things you can imagine, right? In a regime, they did it and put Cuba into misery and poverty. Today, there's no electricity. As Galante rightly reminded us, they're without power, they're in a crisis, and the people confronted the police. The people who used to fear the police of the communist regime so much, who killed, who tortured, are now standing up, they're fighting back. Why? Because the regime is weakened. When the flow of money is cut off, regimes become weaker. And then they say that Trump doesn't know what to do over there in Iran. Pay attention. We're going to talk about Iran. We're going to talk about China, the practical result of Trump's visit to China and how weakened China is at this very moment. So stay here with us because this conversation with Galante is far from over. We're going to bring you all the details about geopolitics and what's happening behind the scenes. And you will understand how to read this map. Well, Galante, Trump already has all the justifications to station, if we can put it that way, aircraft carriers off the Cuban coast, precisely to enforce this arrest warrant, right, against the Cuban dictator. And nothing is more symbolic than arresting one of the Castro brothers. Right, so the heads, the masterminds behind the regime that challenged the United States, and also above all, let's not forget, behind the Sao Paulo Forum. And that's where Brazil comes in, and that's where Lula comes in, who is desperate, as we said, a dinosaur, seeing extinction coming in the form of aircraft carriers, in the form of United States military forces that are about to arrive in Cuba. And I have no doubt that the fall of Maduro in Venezuela greatly weakened Lula's regime here in Brazil, and the fall of the Cuban regime will weaken Lula even more in Brazil. You can be sure of that. I would even like you who are watching us to comment below, will Lula fall or will Cuba survive? Comment here, comment here. I want to see if you're paying attention to the geopolitical analysis. Galante, now look. The CIA director meeting face to face, that's because the regime is already quite weakened. A few years ago, this would have been impossible. Yeah, the simple fact that you're sitting down to negotiate already shows a lot.
It's more than just negotiating. It's receiving the head of intelligence of the country's largest military force.
Your opponent,
your geopolitical opponent, and having this direct conversation with members of the high command of the socialist regime. This was reported 6 months ago, and there are behind-the-scenes discussions. Secretary of State Marco Rubio himself has already said that these conversations are happening. So when you see a secretary at the level of the CIA director traveling to Cuba, it's because the negotiations are already underway. They are very advanced, and the regime is really looking for an honorable way out, if there is such an honorable way out. But the very important fact was what happened yesterday. It was the extradition of Alex Saab, who was the financial operator, a Colombian who was the financial operator for Maduro. He was a minister in several ministries, not only under Chavez, but also under Maduro. He is widely recognized as the financial operator. Maduro's financial operator was already arrested in the United States in 2020-2021 and released in that negotiation in which Biden released Maduro's nephews and his wife's sons, who were arrested for association with drug trafficking, and also Saab at the time. In other words, they were exchanged for Venezuela's promise to hold direct and free elections with international observers. What happened? In 2023, they laughed in President Biden's face, went there, blatantly stole the election, and stayed in power. That's when the complete breakdown of any kind of negotiation or democratic transition in Venezuela happened. Let's move on to Cuba. The same thing is happening. Cuba hasn't had elections for more than 50 or 60 years. Yeah, there isn't even an opposition party there, like there was Maria Corina and Gonzalez in Venezuela, who were basically either eliminated, imprisoned, or prevented from running. Yeah, like in Brazil today, President Bolsonaro is jailed and barred from running.
What happened? Did the election take place?
What happened? In 2023, they laughed at President Biden. They went there blatantly against everyone. What now? How do we deal with this? Nothing is allowed in except food. Fuel is not allowed in. So that there is no supply from Russia, nor from China, nor from Iran. What happened? They blatantly stole the election there, blatantly stole the election, and if they continued, blatantly stole the election, and if they continued, what happened? They stayed in power. President Biden, blatantly, what happened? What happened? Blatantly, they blatantly continued the election. What happened? In 2023, John Ratcliffe went there to deliver a message. Of course, it will no longer be tolerated. Cuba is continuing to collaborate with Iran, with Russia and China here, just 150 kilometers from our coast. Either you change the regime or the regime will be changed. So the two pressure tactics, you have a popular uprising that was certainly stirred up by the CIA, and this popular uprising also had its reasons. The reason is the lack of power. There's no power anymore, and soon the little fuel that was left in reserve will also be gone. Cars won't be able to go anywhere. People will have to walk or ride bicycles. And there's also a shortage of bicycles. Most people don't have bicycles. And you have a thuggish, tottering regime that wants to negotiate at any cost to stay in power. So two things can happen. Either there will be a transition like a Delcy Rodriguez, a henchman of Raul Castro in power, and the direct threat of his father's arrest is just another tool. Look, either you make a deal with us now, close the agreement here before I go back to the United States. Because next time I return, it won't be with folders and documents. I'll come back with the Rangers and Navy SEALs to arrest your father.
That was already expected when Maduro was arrested. It had already been announced that Cuba would fall by the end of 2026, right? Yeah, and now, obviously, after finishing all the operations in Iran, the next target, without a doubt. And the current issue is that Trump, he's not hiding it from anyone ever since he took office. He announced, look, this one will fall, this one will fall, and this one will fall, and they're falling. Right? There are a lot of people who...
What sped up?
Go ahead.
What sped up this chaotic, calamitous situation in Cuba was really the intervention in Iran, because when Trump intervened in Iran, the source of money and fuel dried up. So the fuel would never have run out in Cuba if the source hadn't dried up. And what's the second source? Russia. And you see that on the same day, Sunday, when Alex Saab was extradited, when Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA, was in Cuba, it was the same day that Ukraine launched the biggest drone attack on Russia, even in the capital. There were 550 drones, with almost 400 hitting the capital. Cars on fire, train stations, apartment buildings, and offices in the Russian capital. In other words, the war has reached the backyard, not even the backyard.
Right, on the windowsill.
On the windowsill, on the doormat at Putin's front door.
At the Kremlin. Yeah. I think this would be the first time since World War II that there's been such a massive attack against Moscow, right, against the Russian capital. But it had never happened before. The world is different indeed. Yeah, so Venezuela falls, Iran falls, Russia is extremely weakened, and China is frightened. Because China could stand up to the United States and say, no, these are my partners. These are my proxies. You don't touch them or I'll blow you up with a nuclear bomb. No way. Trump is having a field day, even in Taiwan, right? Look. And then the gallant Trump, guys, he's putting the United States in the best position they've had since World War II. Pay attention to that. Look, you control Venezuela. The United States controls Venezuela. The largest oil reserve in the world, right? Yeah, now you control the Strait of Hormuz. The second largest oil reserve in the world. At least 20% of all the oil consumed passes through there. And at least 50% of the oil that China needs to keep its war machine running. Unlike the United States, guys. Total, which has abundant supplies of oil and energy. And it's not just oil. The United States is rich in oil, in gas, in many other forms of energy. China doesn't have that. China depends 100% on extracting oil from other places in the world. China depends on this maritime transport. This is one of the crucial differences in who can actually win a war. And today we are seeing this in Iran. We are seeing it all over the world. Who wins a war is the one who has fuel trucks or tankers moving around. If you don't have oil circulating to, first, supply your industry that manufactures your weapons, that manufactures your defense. Then you don't have the ships that take fuel to the soldier on the front line. You're doomed to failure. And Russia has already shown that it doesn't have this logistical capability. Russia has oil, Russia has gas, but it doesn't have the logistical capability to defend its interests in the world. Does China have it? China is showing that it doesn't have it either. China acts deceptively. While she was shaking hands with Trump. Soon, Galante will talk about Trump's meeting in China. But while they were shaking hands there, China was secretly supplying an arsenal of weapons to Iran, just so you understand the level of deceit. Not that the United States hasn't done the same, right? Yeah, at other times, and they're doing exactly the same thing in Cuba, for example. But just so you understand the geopolitical perspective. And then Trump's trump card, then Venezuela, Strait of Hormuz, Cuba. Because look, Cuba is to the United States what Taiwan is to China. It's just that this time the Soviet Union doesn't control Cuba. Because if Putin and China had a colossal force inside Cuba, Trump would have to keep quiet like he did in the last decade. And in the last decades, they had to stay quiet, accept all the dictatorships that were established, that settled here in Latin America. But Venezuela falls, Cuba's devastated, they don't have any leverage against the United States. Production will even put the map here. Look how close Cuba is to the United States, and look how close Taiwan is to China. But there's a detail. Over there in Taiwan, the United States calls the shots. Not in Cuba. In Cuba, China no longer has the influence it once had, and Russia doesn't either. Even less so. So today, Trump has everything he needs to subjugate the great powers. He just can't put an American flag in Beijing and an American flag in Moscow because of the nuclear bombs. Because these countries are nuclear powers and have, this form of deterrence, something that Brazil doesn't have. But geopolitically, they're in a tough spot. Is it correct for us to analyze it this way, that they're up against the wall?
Certainly. And not only are they up against the wall, but also the visit that Trump made to China. Shall we get into this topic?
Let's go.
It is a very significant visit. In diplomacy, actions and protocol always speak louder than the words exchanged at the table. The first one is something you have already reported very well on your channel, and I follow it too. Of course, I'm your fan. It's the number of presidents and CEOs from technology companies, not just technology, but all American sectors. In other words, there were 26 of the biggest CEOs there, and we're talking about everything from oil to microchips to artificial intelligence. Everyone was there. White money, dangerous, right?
Bank.
It's even dangerous. If that Air Force One goes down,
My God.
You would stop the American economy. It's true. But stop to think about the boldness of the American president. Instead of bringing the diplomatic staff with him, he brought all these people and sat them at the table. He brought the big O. Is that what he's saying? What's the message there? The message there is this. Look, it's not just me who's demanding certain things from you, and I'm going to leave here with something. Otherwise, I won't leave. It's all these people, because all these people, the entire American industry, were the ones responsible for making you rich. You went from a GDP of 2 trillion in 2001, 2002 to a GDP of 20 trillion, 10 times more in 20 years because they hired your workforce, right? And yes, they brought all this industrial strength to China. But since they're with me, all of them are with me the moment we decide that we're going to leave China, and you're going to have a problem. You have 1.4 billion people to feed, your industry is going to collapse. Hey, what's up, my friend? I'm giving you a lifeline here. I'm throwing you a life jacket. Either you grab this lifeline and side with us so that you can have prosperity and not be crushed by your own people, or we're going to leave here and you'll be thrown to the lions. So that's the message. It's simple. He didn't go there as president. He went there with the whole industrial patent technology and know-how system that China doesn't have. That China is an artificial economy, an economy created not only by the American market for industries, but also by the Europeans. And this could put an end to the rising climate.
China is not self-sustaining, I would say. Of course, we say this with all due respect, but it is not self-sustaining in any economic sector in the world. It depends exclusively on doing business with every country, right? But here's the thing, who actually has that kind of money to really buy something from China that means real income for the Chinese? It's the United States, the Europeans, right?
Because your model is useless. It's no use for you because the Chinese model is based on export. They don't have an internal consumer market. Why? Because socialist models, what do? They impoverish the population, disarm and make them poor so they can keep their hegemonic grip on power. Look at what's happening in Brazil. Yeah, it's an exact copy. They have to make people poor, impoverish the population so they depend on the state. But they inflated the industry so much thinking it would last forever depending on the external market. But the moment the United States says, look, we've turned off the tap, we're not going to buy anymore, nothing from you. They have no one to sell to and no way to provide jobs for people. Then comes hunger and then comes an internal revolution, just like what happened. To establish the communist regime in 46, it was the same way. It's always the same. It's always scarcity, hunger, and lack of security, which is what's happening in Cuba now, that causes and accelerates regime changes.
Look, the same thing happened in Venezuela, right? Then hunger comes, then market controls follow. The government trying to control the market, control prices, control exchange rates, control inflation. The government tries to control absolutely everything, doesn't have the competence for it, can't do it, and makes everyone poorer. Yeah, in Cuba, this has been accelerated for quite some time, but this is happening in China too. The thing is, the Chinese propaganda industry is the best and the most formidable in the world. Maybe they lose to Putin when it comes to propaganda, but they manage to put out propaganda saying China is wonderful. But inside, folks, they're having big problems. Look, and Trump didn't need to do much. I think he arrived at the right time, at the moment when Russia weakened and major bubbles burst in China, you see. In China, the real estate bubble burst, right? The real estate market bubble, correct? They started building properties, building cities of the future. They took people's money because the Chinese, they can't invest abroad. The Chinese can't buy dollars. The Chinese who made money, the Chinese middle class who made money. In the Chinese boom of the last decades, they couldn't diversify. So what did the Chinese government do to control this money, to keep the money from leaving there? Yeah, they started selling real estate, building properties. Chinese state-owned companies started building properties, building apartments, houses. Yeah, and that didn't last, right? This market started to collapse. It started to lose value. Because when you start building a lot of properties, you end up with so many properties, it starts losing value, right? It starts to depreciate.
They're cities, right?
Their entire cities.
Entire cities in China, empty, with empty buildings. Evergrande, which is the big Chinese real estate developer, is going bankrupt, and the government is trying to cover up the problem. You have a bankrupt real estate sector. You have the fourth consecutive year of industrial slowdown, of industrial production. You have deflation. Yeah, China, the Chinese machine has stopped. So it has reached a point where it either negotiates to keep manufacturing and operating with other trade partners around the world or the United States. It'll do what it did with Venezuela. Yeah, it suffocated them economically. It's doing it to Cuba. It did it to Iran. The military intervention that occurred in June last year has already concluded. In a country that was without water, wanting to move the capital of Iran, because there was no water left, the reservoirs were at 3% capacity. Iran, all the money they got from oil, they were spending on weapons. And then the red line was crossed when Iran announced it was buying ballistic missiles from China. And those ballistic missiles, as the world saw, it really was true. They managed to sustain a war for almost a month, 35 days, launching ballistic missiles all over the region. Imagine if they had nuclear warheads, which they were prevented from having at the end of that bombing in 2025, June 2025. Imagine if they had nuclear warheads, the damage they could have done. So with the enemy, of course, Iran is not neutralized. Iran is still there, weakened. They still have weapons, they still have cruise missiles, regional missiles, missiles with a range of 3,000 to 4,000 miles, but today they have no reason to launch those missiles. They have no reason to launch those missiles. Do you agree with me? Because there in the Strait of Hormuz, the one most interested in reopening it is Iran itself, because their economy has stopped. The economy has stopped. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
And the economy has stopped. There's no salary to pay the military to keep the people muzzled. There's no more salary to pay for the caste, which isn't communist there, but it's an Islamic caste. There's no money to pay for weapons for both China and Russia to sell them weapons. And maybe that's the reason they captured the Chinese ship. It's just that the ship is basically an ammunition depot. You reported it here. It's an ammunition and weapons depot and everything. It stays there in the Gulf of Oman, delivering and selling weapons so that merchant ships can defend themselves from the Houthis, from the pirates in that area. And then it's a Chinese ship. It happened all of a sudden. Iran went there and seized the ship for themselves. It's either one of two things. Either it was arranged with Iran. Look, pretend you're invading my ship, take it and keep the weapons, or Iran acted out of desperation. They don't have money to buy weapons. And they need it because the armed forces were decimated. They took a huge hit and they need weapons to be able to control their own internal population. Because otherwise, option B, which would be Trump's best option, is feasible, in which the people could revolt, gain access to weapons, and there remove the Iranian Revolutionary Guard from power. Kidnap and remove the leader from power and carry out a democratic revolution, or return to the imperial regime there in Iran, but one that aligns with Western interests, not only those of the United States, but also of Europe. Look
at the move right there. Yeah, Iran needs to really keep the Strait of Hormuz open, but for that to happen, it needs to surrender, right? If it doesn't surrender, the strait remains closed. If it attacks, the United States attacks and the strait remains closed. If they don't attack, the strait remains closed. So really, there aren't many options. The only thing that will determine whether the regime falls or not is Donald Trump's ability. And then the domestic political capacity in the United States to maintain the siege, to keep the American fleet there in the Strait of Hormuz, blocking it, right? That's what's going to suffocate the Iranian regime. There's no need to launch a big attack now, no need for anything major. The big attacks have already happened, right? Now, what would be targeted if there is an attack? It would be the electrical facilities, right? The power plants, right? The energy distribution centers, and that's it. It becomes like Cuba, right? With no energy left, factories can't run, leading to total regime collapse, which the regime wants to avoid. Why hasn't the regime attacked Israel anymore? Why hasn't it launched more ballistic missiles? Right, as Galante brilliantly reminded us. Exactly, because if the regime attacks, Trump has the reason he needs. There's a law in the United States that says the president can't start a war without Congress approval. And Trump has a hard time today getting approval. He would, right, have enormous difficulty getting a war approved because the American people don't want war. The American people don't want Iran to have a nuclear bomb, but they don't want to send soldiers, right, to fight in the Middle East again. Yeah, what did they manage to do? No, let's do an operation, but an operation has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it has to be done within 60 days. Those 60 days ended now at the beginning of May, right? Trump's 60 days are up. What did they do? They stopped that operation, called it finished, and already started another one called the Sledgehammer, right? Operation Sledgehammer, right? They started a new operation, which is a blockade. What is it? Look, Iran can't trade oil. So we're going to use military forces to prevent Iran from trading oil. When is Trump going to attack Iranian territory again? When the Iranians attack an American asset or an ally over there in the strait. So Iran is completely backed into a corner. Iran has nowhere to run except by land, by train, right? That's how the Chinese are sending weapons to Iran. They're not sending oil, right? Trains can't carry the volume of oil that China needs to keep its industry running. But weapons, right? China keeps sending a lot of weapons through the railways that go across Eurasia and connect Iran directly to China. But just having weapons isn't enough. You need to be able to move around. Well, so that's the conclusion we came to. Another bubble I just remembered, Galante, which burst in China and also weakened China, was the electric car bubble. There aren't thousands of electric car factories being built all over the world, right? Guys, pay attention, okay? No one is buying electric cars anymore. No one. If China is building an electric car factory, it's not really a factory. It's anything but a factory. Why? Well, it failed. It went bankrupt. The Chinese electric car industry has collapsed. Why? It depended entirely on subsidies, right? On subsidies from the United States, right? It was the Americans who funded China's electric car industry. Can you believe that? So these green policies from Biden, right? From the Democratic Party, from the German globalists, these green policies, they called for, they passed laws that forced the American taxpayer to pay. Okay, to pay so that the Chinese could build electric cars. So you can't anymore first buy combustion engines, right? Their American factories can't build anymore. They have to invest in these electric cars. But in the United States, there weren't any electric cars, right? In Europe, there weren't any existing electric car factories. Where were they? They were in China. So all the money, right, forced Americans and Europeans to buy cars from China. Look, you can't buy gas-powered cars here, so where am I going to buy a car from? Oh, on the other side of the world, you can buy a car for next to nothing, right? Next to nothing, in quotes, right? And it's okay, this industry grew and took over the world, right? Chinese electric cars took over the world. And guess what, Galante? That's when we see the hypocrisy of all these people, right? Of this green agenda. They built electric cars in China with these environmental laws because it was the environmental law that forced the United States to spend money on electric cars. But China builds electric cars by burning oil and burning coal, right? There's no such thing as a green industry in China. Go ahead, Galante.
There is no green industry in China. One question that nobody asks is, what do you need to charge your electric car? Electricity.
Exactly.
How will you generate electricity? Come on. Energy. Look, it doesn't even reach 8% of the demand. In other words, to supply all the electric cars in the whole world, let's suppose that today oil runs out and there are no more combustion engine cars. For you to supply all the cars in the world, the whole world, everyone generating energy, you don't even have 20% of what's needed to have enough energy to supply the cars. I mean, just the cars, right? The energy production matrix hasn't kept up with the consumption of electric cars. So you see, California had set a ban for 2035 or 2030. Yeah, no factory could build combustion engine cars anymore. Only electric cars. But then you see there's Tesla. Tesla grew, expanded. Then you have the American nationalist movement with the election of Trump empowering Tesla and the banning of certain Chinese brands because of the espionage issue. We've already talked about this here, that the Chinese car platform is a platform for espionage. In fact, they bought the Swedish Volvo. China bought the Swedish Volvo. When you buy Volvo, my friend, you're buying a Chinese espionage platform from a Swedish brand that you trust, right? The fighter jets, the Brazilian fighter jets from Saab Saab is Volvo. The Brazilian fighter jets are made by Saab. Saab is part of Volvo. So they've entered every sphere: political, environmental, diplomatic, economic. So what happens? China has ways to generate energy. Brazil is self-sufficient because it has many rivers and hydroelectric plants. It uses hydroelectric power because of the rivers and plateau rivers where there is a drop and you use gravity. That's the kind of energy available because it uses gravity to spin a propeller, and that propeller is a turbine. But to spin that propeller, you can also spin it using nuclear energy. So nuclear plants that heat up, it's like a fire that heats the water. The steam spins a propeller that creates energy. Wind power is when the propeller itself spins with the wind, creating energy. But China hasn't invested in nuclear plants, and there are wind limitations because it's not one of the best areas in the world for wind. So what does it use? It uses coal. It uses coal to heat the water, to create steam, to generate energy, or it uses coal and diesel oil. Yeah. Where does this diesel oil come from? It comes from the Strait of Hormuz. 30% of it comes through the Strait of Hormuz, and 90% of fossil fuel energy goes to China. So the other bottleneck that China has is the Strait of Malacca, which is over there in Indonesia, where if you add the Strait of Hormuz and Malacca together, that's where the Chinese ships pass through. To bring fossil fuel to China, since they need to import almost 70% of their fossil fuel to keep their energy running. In other words, the United States makes agreements with Indonesia, military agreements and security for the Strait of Malacca. So today the United States has the upper hand. He keeps the Strait of Hormuz closed for an indefinite period because he doesn't need Congress approval for that, and he closes the Strait of Malacca if necessary. That's why Trump went to China, sat at the table and said, hey, are we going to be friends? Are we going to work together to grow our economies? Or are we going to have to get into a real confrontation? It's because the ball is in Xi Jinping's court.
It's in his court, right? In concrete terms, if you look at it, right, no major purchase deal was announced. Of course, China is buying oil from the United States. It's 600,000 gallons a day. That's nothing, right? It's nothing compared to what China needs to keep its industry running. They bought, Boeing jets, right? The 777 MAX, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? Yeah, it also wasn't the number they expected. But the real deal is happening behind the scenes, behind the curtain, right? Trump brings in the biggest businessmen in the world, the ones who are in control. They control the world. You've got the guy from BlackRock. BlackRock controls everything. Everything you can possibly imagine exists in the world, guys. Something, at least to some extent, is controlled by this BlackRock. Yeah, and Taiwan. And Taiwan, right? He has Taiwan.
Why is Taiwan important? Why is Taiwan important? You already mentioned its location first.
It's like a gateway, right? Put it up on screen, guys. While Galante is talking, let's show Taiwan how Taiwan is a gateway for the Chinese Navy to expand into the Pacific. Look, today China can't sail freely through the Pacific, which would be the solution to all their problems. First, it would make the Chinese Navy global, not just regional. Chavez?
Luis.
That would also keep the flow of oil open, right? Almost infinite, to supply the Chinese war machine and industrial machine. So the Taiwan Strait is first a gateway. Then Taiwan manufactures very important things, Galante.
Yes, 95% of chips and semiconductors, microchips and semiconductors are made in Taiwan. How did that happen? You have the VIA, and a technology that's already established because Taiwan, first of all, is a thorn in the side politically because they're a democracy. Yeah? Believe it or not, Shimon Oliveira, the safest and most transparent elections in the world are in Taiwan.
Wow, huh?
There, the election is done on paper. It's counted at the polling stations for everyone to see, publicly on television for everyone to see. And then they add up those votes, and on the same day, they announce the result of their election. It's considered the most transparent and reliable electoral process in the world.
That's why Taiwan is a democracy.
China hates it because it's a thorn in their side. It's like a knife stuck in China's ribs and says, look, we're of the same race and we're successful without being communists. And that's important. And the issue of semiconductors, that's going to end. Why? Because even TSMC, which is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, has already opened a campus there in Arizona, in the state of Arizona, near Phoenix, in the United States, and it's already operating at 50% capacity. Look at that. Next year, when they're operating at 100% capacity theoretically, even if China invades Taiwan, the United States, and Nvidia and the CEO of Nvidia was visiting China together with Trump, they can now dominate microprocessor production on Nvidia's territory. Microprocessor production on American territory. You saw that article, right? If China takes Taiwan, strategically and economically, there would be no impact for the United States. There would be a geostrategic impact, which is what you just mentioned. It would be a geostrategic impact, which is what you just said, the opening of a choke point for Chinese military bases. And the opening of an opening China is very much not step by step, stuck, but that's a whole different story. You force China to operate in a theater close to its own coast and no longer in a theater where it currently operates with some risk, which is the Caribbean, because it has friends there, Cuba and Venezuela, or at least it used to, right? It operates in Latin America, where it has friends. Brazil is theirs. It can operate there in the Arabian Sea, where it also has friends, like Iran, but this house of cards is falling. Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela. China has to strategically retreat to its own backyard, which is Taiwan, and remain there as a geostrategic adversary on the other side of the world, not in the backyard and at the doorstep of the United States. Do you understand now why Trump's visit to China is happening at this exact moment?
Look, everyone, this is going to directly impact policies in Brazil. It's already having an impact, right? You already have Lula quite weakened, and you can even see Lula's desperation. I believe you've already noticed that, right? Lula hasn't had any peace since Maduro fell and was arrested. Lula hasn't been at peace anymore. Why? Because they're involved, right? Trump wouldn't go after Lula just because he's left-wing, guys. No, he would go after Lula because he's the boss, okay? He's one of the bosses. You know how in video games you have to beat the boss to move on to the next level? And Lula is one of those bosses from the São Paulo Forum. He's one of the founders of the São Paulo Forum, and he admitted that at the UN. Now in 2025, right? He said that he's one of the founders along with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, along with Castro, the first Castro, Galante, I forgot his name now. Raul Castro, Fidel, right?
Fidel Castro, yeah, his brother Raul Castro.
Yeah, they founded the São Paulo Forum together to control Latin America, and they succeeded. They managed to take over all the Latin American countries through voting, through free elections. Then you say, but the government is legitimate. Hold on, stop to look at the mechanisms that put them in power, and then you'll understand that it's not as legitimate as you thought or as people imagine, because people don't look into it deeply, right?
And free in quotation marks, free elections in quotation marks.
Exactly.
You see that this socialist march throughout Latin America only consolidated after the introduction of electronic voting machines by the Venezuelan company Smartmatic, whose president was Hugo Chavez, who took part in the inauguration of this São Paulo Forum. So now you have countries that have created stronger mechanisms for electoral transparency, like Ecuador, Argentina, even Bolivia itself, even Venezuela itself, which would be the paper trail. They are already changing regimes. Basically, the regime has completely changed. Chile, Ecuador, and there's an election now in June next month in Colombia. Also with the new electoral system.
But any regime has fallen, right?
Paper trail.
But regime that has
potential to fall. The polls
are showing that Rafael Cortez, it's Rafael, I forgot his last name now, but it's Rafael. Yeah, he's losing the campaigns, right? His candidate, not him, his candidate, right, is losing there, even in the polls. Another thing that also makes these elections questionable is vote buying, right? You have big industries. So what happens? They came to power. They had to manage to come to power through the vote. So they took over the universities, they took over the educational centers, they took over the judiciary, right? They were very patient. They kept doing this for 20 years, for decades. They succeeded. Then they took part in elections, they won, and then they never left power. Did you notice that they never left power? Why? They came to power, they took state money and gave this state money through banks like BNDES to their groups, to their handpicked businessmen. So here in Brazil, you have Odebrecht, you had JBS, and you have other companies connected to OAS. Exactly, connected to the friends in power, right? So you give this state money to these big companies, and these big companies were financed with money from BNDES. For example, give it back to the party in the form of obviously bribes, corruption, and everything you can imagine, so that this party can refinance the next campaign, you know? So it never stops. It's infinite money because you never stop paying taxes. And each time you pay more taxes. Have you noticed that? That now in this year of 2026, 25, 26, 24, they have doubled the tax burden even more on Brazilians. Because this money goes to the government pours this huge amount of money into these companies with BNDES financing, with this money that is obligatorily allocated. Buys the gas cylinder, right? Gives the gas cylinder to the voter, right? Gives Bolsa Familia to the voter, gives this and gives that. They also still receive money directly from this industry. So the king's friends, they are owners. And we talked about this in our last chat. They own banks, they own refineries, oil refineries, right? They own thermoelectric plants, they own power plants, right? They own meat packing plants. Now they're going to control a missile factory, right? A Brazilian military equipment factory. So they're in all the strategic sectors. Why? To make sure to keep Molasco in power, Hugo Chavez, the Cubans in power, they're there. Because the money pours in, yeah, that's it. The state pours money into these companies, which pay bribes so they can buy votes. This is the system that the São Paulo Forum implemented. And they also use, we haven't talked about this yet, they also use drug trafficking, right? And that's their connection with organized crime, because the money from organized crime comes back to finance campaigns. That's how it works in Mexico, that's how it works throughout Latin America, and that's how it works in Brazil too. But this isn't on Jornal Nacional Galante. No.
Okay. Notice that Odebrecht did construction work there at the port of Mariel, right in front of Cuba. Note they also did the Petro project in Caracas and other refinery projects. Yeah, and you have a system where they enrich themselves, exactly as you said. Imagine Lula's concern with Alex Saab's deportation yesterday from Venezuela to the United States. He's going to end up as Maduro's cellmate there in Brooklyn, New York. And don't be fooled, these people are being interrogated. They're making plea bargain deals, and Polo Carvajal is already there too. They don't want to die alone from starvation and in solitary confinement in the United States. They want to have some kind of amnesty so they can at least live in a small apartment, be able to walk in Central Park, stay here, and maybe, if they're really lucky, spend the money they have in Switzerland or even in the Vatican Bank. Their money is just sitting there, and now the American Pope seems to have sat on top of that money that was in the Vatican.
Why are they fighting?
So there's a very big web of interest. Let's see what the next steps will reveal.
Well, you brought it up, and of course it's even taboo to talk about this, right? Because Brazil is mostly Christian, so you're stirring up a hornet's nest. But look, folks, why do you think Trump? Do you think Trump is crazy, messing with the Pope? Because Trump is fighting with the Pope. Now, Trump is going to fight with the Pope. A lot of people get shocked, right? He's going to fight with the Pope, and this Pope is even, as they say, even right-wing, a conservative Pope. Guys, there's a scheme that Galante brought up, right? Which is the Vatican Bank. What does Trump want? He wants the information about the money that's in the Vatican Bank, right? And then when you start to find out that there's mafia money, organized crime money, terrorism money that goes through the Vatican Bank, money from Iran that goes through the Vatican Bank, then you understand why the Pope is sitting on top of it. Because if the church reveals this information now, it's a huge scandal. How could that be? The church's bank keeping terrorists' money? All right.
Even a justice of Brazil's Supreme Federal Court used to receive money through the Vatican Bank for giving lectures in Rome. Man, that was a free-for-all. Well, it's a bank.
Right, like any other, but it's from the Vatican, right? I wonder if Banco Master
Does Banco Master exist in
exists.
the Papal Bank?
The Papal Bank, the Vatican Bank. Guys, did you manage to read the map? There's a lot happening at the same time, and here's the thing. These things don't happen overnight. Take Cuba, for example. The fall of Cuba. The fall of Cuba has been happening since Trump took office in 2025 and started going after Maduro, right? He goes after Maduro, arrests Maduro, and controls the Venezuelan regime. Well, now, many months later, right, Iran then eliminates the Ayatollah in the first hour of the war, and the fall of the regime begins. You've already created a disconnect. Iran, Venezuela, and you've already brought down the axis of dictatorships. Iran, Venezuela, China, Russia, North Korea, including the crazy guy from North Korea, the flamboyant one. This one is going to be a bonus for those who are following us now. The crazy guy from North Korea just established a law, a new law that didn't exist before, now it does. Because he's afraid of being eliminated, because he doesn't feel safe anymore, like he saw happen with the Ayatollah. So what did he do? He put a law in place. If he dies, North Korea's nuclear bombs will automatically be launched against the aggressor, right? Against the United States, against Europe, basically against whoever eliminated him. Automatically. There's no approval, no new regime, nothing, right? Yeah, if they hit the dictator, North Korea will automatically launch that bomb without asking any questions, right? Why? Because he saw what the Americans did to the Ayatollahs. And now everyone looks at Iran and says, Iran is weak, Iran has no capability at all. Iran was considered the greatest power in the Middle East, including militarily, and the Ayatollah was considered untouchable, right? So the fall of the Ayatollah in the first hour of the war, in the first few minutes, the war started with the elimination of the Ayatollah, shows dictators that none of them are safe. Xi Jinping trembled, Putin trembled, and Lula trembled. Lula was scared to death because first, here's the thing. They were counting on the old global organization, on the old law of diplomacy, right? With the old school, that is, I do whatever I want and you keep negotiating forever. You will never have the courage. You will never have the support for a real operation to eliminate them. That was unimaginable in Lula's mind, unimaginable in the minds of the Ayatollahs, that one day an American president and the Israeli prime minister would have the courage to eliminate them.
Paradigm shift. A paradigm shift. It's a huge paradigm shift where you have a president ordering the decapitation or capture of a head of state. And as it has already happened twice, it's like that Arab saying, if something happens once, it may never happen again. But if it happens twice, it will certainly happen a third time. So that's the reason why John Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA, is there in Cuba to say, look, don't force us to do it a third time. And it's not just Kim Jong-un who's there, scared to death and also paranoid about his health condition. Xi Jinping has also been through a lot. He suffered a coup d'etat in the past at the end of last year. Yeah, out of his 7 military leaders, he fired 5. In other words, the deputy chief of the armed forces, whom he himself appointed, he chose him, he moved up in the party ranks, and he was handpicked by Xi Jinping, is still missing. 2 months ago, he was removed and has been missing ever since. Not even his family knows where he is. Imagine one day you're the chief of the Chinese armed forces, standing right there on the platform. You have power, you have security, you command the military apparatus, and you're loyal to your top leader. And one day you don't come home, you disappear, and no one knows where you are. In other words, this shows that internally and here comes the cherry on top of our conversation today. That was the first thing Xi Jinping said when he raised the issue at the summit. Look, Taiwan is off limits at this summit. Taiwan is our red line. We are not going to discuss Taiwan. So you, President Trump, would you defend Taiwan if there were a possible Chinese invasion of Taiwan? He didn't answer yes and he didn't answer no. No. He said that if China dares to make a move like that, it could pay a price it can't afford. And that was the answer from the American president. Yeah, but when Xi Jinping asked that question, he wasn't talking to the American president. He was talking to his own base. Yeah, his base, so he can try to gain the trust of the Chinese military, showing that his intention is to annex Taiwan. And for that, he needs them. So they have to be on his side. But when he said that, he was speaking to his own base, not to President Trump. He got the answer he didn't want to hear, which was that the United States is willing to defend Taiwan, and that's the policy, the diplomacy of ambiguity. The United States does not recognize Taiwan as a country, but it also gives Taiwan technological, scientific, and military support. It's not just President Trump. All the presidents since the Chiang Kai-shek family fled to the island of Taiwan and established a democratic regime there. So the other one who has to be concerned besides Kim Jong-un is Xi Jinping. His military support base inside China is wavering. And obviously, let's cross the Pacific to get to Brazil. Lula himself has been making gestures, as you just mentioned, to revitalize the Brazilian military-industrial base with the acquisition by friends of Vibras itself, but also bills moving through Congress so that the military don't have to pay taxes. A package of 200 billion reais for arms purchases and the slick talk about sovereignty, that the military has been run into the ground, that the armed forces have been run into the ground. Come on. The Brazilian armed forces have been run into the ground since Fernando Henrique's time. Everyone knows that the left is anti-patriotic, anti-military. They've weakened them all these years. But now, when election time comes, they have to make speeches about sovereignty and patriotism. But this talk of sovereignty and patriotism doesn't match with the military. Going hungry, without toilet paper to clean themselves, and without food in the mess hall to eat. Not to mention there's also a shortage of gasoline. To operate the tanks or the fighter jets, it's not just me saying this. The Minister of Defense himself went to Congress saying they don't even have fuel to operate the machinery. So Lula is also somewhat concerned, just like Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping.
Yeah, you destroyed the force, right? You have no love for your country at all. Quite the opposite. Lula used to say he wanted a globalized government, right? Government. Universal. He talked about that last year, right? He wanted a universal government.
What are the armed forces for? He said that several times. What are the armed forces for?
And that's what happened. Now with this little speech to win votes, to create a smokescreen and steal a little more money, right? Because if you haven't invested in the armed forces in the last 30 years, it's not now, right, in a year, that you're going to be able to build up Brazil's military strength to defend against a possible operation by the United States here, right? You take 2 American cars, a frigate, you take a few helicopters. That already surpasses all the combined Latin American forces, right? Given the extremely advanced technology, and it's not just technology, it's real combat capability, right? Because Brazil hasn't fought a war in a long time. Brazil doesn't even have experience defending its own territory. Now, right, in this modern era, right, the last war we had to fight for territory was against Paraguay. Look, guys, right, Brazil doesn't have the fuel to defend itself. Galante, I think we've already given a full overview of the map here, right? Those who followed us might even have a lot of information, because it's a lot of information, but that's it, folks. Read it, and the next target, once it's done, and maybe it'll even fall before that, right? Once the war in Iran is over, you have Cuba. But the way things are going, Cuba is already far along in the process, Galante. Thank you.
That's what I say on my social media for those who follow me there at Mauricio Galante. I ask your listeners to follow us on our social media and also on YouTube at Galanteas. And I say, yeah, I said it months ago, who falls first, either Iran or Cuba? Today, after our conversation and this exchange of information, which you also have a lot of a very faithful interpretation, very realistic of what is happening behind the scenes. But I see that a visit by a high-ranking American official to Cuba precedes it. Well, even I would go. A visit from President Trump to Cuba to restore diplomatic, commercial, and military ties, and a new day for the island of Cuba. The United States brings food, supplies, medical support, opens the borders, and now Cuba has decided to hold democratic elections. And in 6 months, can you imagine something like that? Yeah, it doesn't hurt to dream, right, Shimon Oliveira? It doesn't hurt to dream. But the challenge has been made here on your show. No, we'll be back.
It's recorded, then we'll come back here to talk about it. Hey guys, it really happened, right? Of course, right? Maybe it won't happen like a Hollywood movie, right? Like we suddenly imagine, but look at what happened in Venezuela, right? You already have total control of Venezuela, right? Where to do anything, you have to pick up the phone and call Washington. Otherwise, it just doesn't happen.
Shimon, didn't President Trump 1.0 go to the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea and cross the border with Kim Jong-un and shake his hand? He did. What stops the same president who is now breaking paradigms and decapitating? I think, do we have anything concrete? Enemies of the United States? What stops him now from crossing 150 kilometers of water and landing in Cuba to do the same thing? I think nothing, right? The chances of that happening are greater than the chances of it not happening. That's why I see it that way.
Yeah, because there you subjugate the Sao Paulo Forum. There you subjugate Russia, the Soviet Union, right? And there you subjugate Chinese imperialism. All at the same point in the world. So Cuba never was...
I think that before the midterm elections, when the Latino vote will be important and essential for them to maintain control of Congress and the Senate.
Galante. So it has to be now, right? Cuba's fall has to happen now to allow enough time. What month is the midterm election, Galante?
It's in November.
Look, guys, so we have a few more months for Cuba to fall. If Trump does this, he really wins everything. I think he wins everything because it changes everything completely, right? Cuba is a paradigm. Cuba is a thorn in the American side. Cuba represents one of the most shameful defeats, right, that the Americans suffered in terms of propaganda for the Soviet Union, for communism in the world, right? Because the communists see Cuba as a communist paradise. That worked, according to the data. The reversal, their upside down view of the world, right? But then Trump stepping into Cuba and establishing a democracy there. And yes, folks, unlike Iran, it's different from the countries in the Middle East. Cuba can indeed have a democracy. It can restore democracy there, right? They're a Western Christian people.
Let's go. Yeah, Taiwan, like Taiwan.
Like Taiwan.
And what's the next step going to be? It's going to be mapping things out, which is already underway. There's an investigation in the American Congress and Senate to find out what influence China has over Brazilian agriculture and the use of Brazilian agriculture as a geopolitical weapon against the United States.
My God.
You have the mapping of China's involvement in infrastructure, electricity, agriculture, corruption of political authorities throughout Latin America, not just in Peru with the port of Chancay, but across Brazil and other countries. And then you have the mapping, you have monitoring, and you have the removal of China from the Western Hemisphere and the neutralization of China in the Western Hemisphere. As you yourself say, it's a process. It doesn't happen overnight, but step by step, I see that it's moving in that direction. And the sooner Brazil makes its choice, and this opportunity was given to President Lula behind closed doors with President Trump, the sooner Brazil makes its choice, the less the Brazilian population will suffer. like the Venezuelan population suffered for so many years, and like the Cuban population today, who don't have electricity, clean water, or food to eat, have suffered for 65 years. So it's not necessary to suffer in order to learn. We need to see clearly and we need to make decisions. I hope Brazil is on the side of reason.
Venezuela didn't believe that Maduro would fall there. The Cubans didn't believe, right, that the regime would be overthrown there one day. The Iranian regime also didn't believe that the United States and Israel would have the courage to do what they did. And Brazil, I'm sure most Brazilians say no, it couldn't happen, right? It would be nice if Trump could save Brazil, but nobody expects it, guys. And if Brazil is ever saved, right, I hope it won't be necessary, but if it does happen someday, it won't be like in a superhero movie, right? A helicopter comes, lands in Brasilia, takes Lula away, and solves Brazil's problems. No, it's going to be more like suffocation. So nothing comes in and nothing goes out, and then everyone pays the price. Just like the Cubans are paying, like the Iranian people are paying, and like the Venezuelan people have paid, right? So you don't want that to happen, right? There are a lot of people who come here, Galante, to our channel and ask, when is Trump coming to Brazil? You don't want him to come, guys. Because everyone will go hungry, everyone will suffer, and Lula will be the last one to be caught. Moraes will be among the last to be caught. Why? Because that's how real life works. Galante, are you going to show a book there? What are you going to show us?
Simo, I'm going to give you this book from a great friend of mine, Luis Fernando Bapistella. It's Counterintelligence. He is one of the greatest minds in intelligence data analysis, and counterintelligence. Fantastic, fantastic. So it's an essential book for your followers and our followers to be able to do this geopolitical mapping and data mapping, and to understand how actions, not only behind the scenes, but also reported actions, influence the world we live in. So I recommend reading it. It's on Amazon. Counterintelligence, Luis Fernando Bapistella.
Show the cover again. Show it again. This is the English version.
This is the English version.
But there's a Portuguese version.
Counterintelligence. Yes, there is a Portuguese version.
It's on Amazon.
Luis Fernando Bapistella. It's on Amazon, yes. So
guys, I'll try, I can't promise, but I'll try to make the book available for you to buy directly here on the channel, okay? If it's here, it's because I managed to do it, all right? Let's go. Otherwise, I'll leave the link here for you in the first pinned comment so you can get this book that will open and expand your mind. So you won't be caught off guard, so you won't be caught by surprise, so you can build your savings and your investments.
They will be manipulated.
Not to be manipulated, right? You need to be ahead. And we even created our intelligence bunker where we analyze things more deeply without the filters we're forced to use here. The link is also in the description in the first pinned comment. And here, look, the QR code is showing up on the screen now, so you can go there. There are already more than 3,000 subscribers in this censorship-free community that gets the information before everyone else. We also created our series and movies channel where we review things without the woke culture, without all that whining, with content for you to enjoy with your family. All right, folks. Galante, once again, your social media so our audience can follow you. Folks, follow Galante. I want you to go to his channel and say, I came from Shimon Oliveira's channel. Go to Galante's YouTube and Galante's Instagram. Tell us the address, Galante.
On YouTube, M Galante Magalante Use, also on X, M Galante Magalante Use, and on Instagram, it's the full name, Mauricio Galante Use, by the way.
We are doing a collab with Galante here on YouTube, so click that little button, his face will show up, go there and follow Galante. Or, you already have it there, just type his name, Mauricio Galante, and it will show up for you to follow as well. Follow him and say, I came from Shimon Oliveira's channel. Let's show the power of our community, okay, guys? Galante, it was a great chat, and we'll be back as soon as things move forward a bit more. We'll be back here bringing all the behind-the-scenes details of geopolitics. Bye-bye, everyone.